substance equals spin. The propaganda's a win, stress feeding on my tension. My countrymen, they love their fiction. Words upon now, it's made with good intentions.
Welcome to 10200 Current Events Edition. We have a stacked lineup of co-hosts this morning for your listening pleasure. We have me, Philip. That's my name. I'm one of the co-hosts of this podcast, and we talk about things such as current events and politics and whatnot. We also have Simone, because Ginny's crying into her hand. How are you, Simone?
Band. Hi, Philip. I have discovered Slutstrand technology. So, for your visual pleasure audience, which you won't get to see, there's that going on.
The constant commitment to the bit of being attractive on an audio medium. Simone, I respect
You
your...
people have no idea how old we are.
Speak for yourself.
I'm good. Yeah, just chilling.
Another fire introduction from the 10200 podcast co-host. We also have Ginny. How are you, Ginny?
Well,
Ginny.
no, it's great. I'm fine. I'm great. I'm thinking about anime girl racehorses. That's what I'm doing.
Who isn't thinking about anime girls on a Saturday?
To be fair, that's why my introduction was so terrible.
You're
Steal somebody
looking
else's
watching a
joke.
race
CIA
right now.
stands for chillin'. It's awesome.
Simone, also you might want to you need a couple more strands to do the slut strand thing. You need more strands of hair visible.
You need more strands
Just
of
the
hair
one
than
is not
this?
enough.
Okay, this is more than one, but
You need yeah. Normally it's also on the other side as well, so they frame the face. Not to
Okay.
police someone's sluttiness. I'm just saying.
Problematic.
Next time I go to Pack and Save, I will do that.
Well, Aura will need to check in on the slut strand specificity.
Yeah, Aura is ranking us out of 1 to 10 these days.
The fashion police has become the real police.
Well, everybody who is a loss prevention officer is a certified pervert.
Okay, look, we have a few things to talk about this morning. I would like to kick off with a bit of early childhood education change stuff, and then segue into some criminal law changes that are either kicking off or at least being kind of signposted as potential things to kick off. But to kick over to our resident education expert / horse racing enthusiast, I should say, could you frame up what's been going on in education / early childhood education world for us?
Yeah, so this has been an ongoing thing throughout the coalition's time. One of the ACT Party's big bugbears, one of the areas where David Seymour's been particularly active. I've talked about it on the cast before a few times, but essentially, our early childhood education system is the most privatized of all of our education platforms. I think mostly down to the fact that infrastructurally, it's the easiest to set up. You can literally turn a residential property into an early childhood center, which I think some places have done. I'm not an expert in early childhood education. I've mostly just been following because as a teacher, I've got to be aware of the flow-on effects. But
they have. I've visited
Awesome.
maybe 100 ECE centers.
Oh God.
There are a bunch that were literally a house, and someone thought, I could buy a new house and leverage this as a source of income and just fill it with 40 2-year-olds and get a bunch of money from the government. And that's kind of what they do. And results are, let's say, mixed.
A mixed to terrible. So most recently, we're sort of grappling with the changes. There's two big changes that have happened recently that I don't think I've talked about on the cast. One of them is the pay changes, and one of them is increasing clarity around the red tape that the Ministry of Regulation is cutting. This is where early childhood is so unlucky because they're getting both barrels. They're getting Associate Education Minister David Seymour, but then they're also getting Minister of Regulation David Seymour, which kind of sucks. So basically the changes in pay, along with the scrapping of pay equity, which would have greatly impacted early childhood, there was also a change to pay parity, where essentially they've already cut relief teachers from the scheme, the pay parity scheme, and now they are, I think, attempting to reduce the amount of pay that trained professionals are eligible for. So if you have like a master's in early childhood education, formally you would get pay parity. I think I really should have read up on this before I did it, but you would get pay parity with like primary school or secondary teachers, or you would get like very attractive, well, relatively attractive pay rates. But now, in their infinite wisdom, the ministry is allowing early childhood centres to, flexibly let the market choose the pay rates for these teachers, which of course is the lowest, generally the lowest rate that can be gotten away with. The changes that I'm much more familiar with are the more recent ones around sort of health and safety rules. I guess it's being framed as like cutting red tape, but what it's really doing is like allowing for more endangerment of children for profit, I guess, is like the only real explanation. So the most recent one that was extremely shocking is essentially a relaxation of the sleep check rules. So formerly, a early childhood centre for every child who's asleep had to be checked every 10 minutes. Obviously, that's not fitting in with profit-driven early childhood, so it's being changed to every 15 minutes. This is something that David Seymour called excessive and confusing regulation. But pretty much every professional is like losing their shit because they're like, no, that 5 minutes actually really matters when it's a young child. I've got an article up here. There's Dr. Sarah Alexander said that an infant can choke on and vomit, roll over, fall out, climb out of their cot. They could be wide awake, crying their eyes out for 15 minutes before they're checked on. The current wording of the the law is that they have to be checked on every 5 to 10 minutes, which would be increased to 10 to 15 minutes or more frequently according to individual needs, which seems like a great little cop out there. Now, under the current legislation, there are still children in unsafe situations. So this is just sort of widening that. But I want to take a step back. So I've outlined sort of we've got these changes where essentially there's a disincentivization of professionals in early childhood through cutting of their pay on a systemic level. And I know that like David Seymour would say, oh, this just allows for professional trained early childhood educators to negotiate for higher wages because they're no longer tied to the same weight, blah blah blah. But it's a sector-wide pay cut for people who have the actual professional education and training, which I guess this ties in a wider level with like the pay equity changes and how teaching as a whole is undervalued. Like I think a lot of people just assume that early childhood education is basically daycare, and it's like no, it's setting up like basic skills and like social conditioning so that children can enter into primary school and be well adjusted because thankfully our incredibly well funded education system oh no, sorry. Our education system is not incredibly well funded and does not have a lot of like catch-up mechanisms. If you start primary school behind, you're gonna, on average, end up in high school well behind. We like as a system, we just don't have the resourcing to catch up everyone. So early childhood education is actually incredibly important for making sure that sort of all these children have a level playing field.
Yeah, I mean, talk to a primary school teacher, right?
Yeah.
The amount of people who come into primary school well behind is bloody depressing. And there are two ways to respond to that as I suppose, a society, an education institutional system. You can talk to every single parent and tell them that they're bad, or you can go to where the vast majority of those kids are coming from, which is early childhood centers, ECEs, and you can look at what they're doing, and some of them are fantastic, some of them are terrible, a lot of them are kind of somewhere in the middle, but improving that by 10% means you start on not such a depressing kind of back footing, like Pmax is saying. That is quite a crucial kind of start to life difference, right?
Mm.
And especially for people on those kind of lower socioeconomic rungs, that can make all the difference between being at the so far behind that you can't follow what's happening in primary school, and therefore so far behind that you can't follow what's happening in high school, and therefore, this flows on through life. And that kind of 5 to 10 minute versus 10 to 15 minute, bracket seems pretty brutal, right? Like, why have a lower threshold for that? That's like the point. Surely the point of those regulations is to have an upper limit.
So here's my theory. What I suspect is being done, because our good friend David Seymour is a huge fan of the market, and the market determining success. And I think because it's very difficult to have a competitive market if the worst you can get is still acceptable quality. That means that like a lot of people are just going to like choose the lowest common, like they're just going to choose the cheapest option because they'll know, okay, bare minimum, my child is still going to be safe, my child is still going to learn things. If you create a scale where there are childhood centers where you can send your child and like all that happens is like the bare minimum legal amount of supervision is happening and they might be in danger, but it's cheap. And then there's like super bougie whatever, like there's French private tutors for each child and then they've got like nannies and it costs extra. Because then like if you have this regime where like and I think the problem with this, if you're taking it seriously, is like a child is going to die and it's all going to have to be reverted. Very sad for the free market liberals. But I literally think what David Seymour is attempting to do is attempting to like ride this tightrope where it's like we get the children as close to death as possible, but we don't actually kill them. So there's like not actually any huge negative effects. But everyone knows that like if you send your child to the cheapest place, they're in danger. So there's like more incentive to like spend more money for the average and better early childhood educations, more profits for early childhood, like bingo, bango, bongo. That might sound absolutely insane, but like
No, it
I,
doesn't. I mean,
I
that's what markets are, right? I think like
yeah,
that's just acknowledging the market reality of if we had a perfect free market in early childcare, you would value the how much do you want your child to stay alive and send them to the relevant ECE that meets the right requirements, you know?
yeah.
And at the moment we have, not sufficient but substantial barriers in the way of early childcare centers letting your baby die on the floor,
Mm,
because they're not being paid enough attention to, for example. And for context, the 10-minute versus 15-minute thing, we're not talking about a parent checking in on their child here, right? We're talking about a room of
like 30 children.
yeah, of babies sleeping where one person pops their head in every 10 minutes and casts their gaze around and ticks a box and says done. So, we're not talking about someone who really has time to do that because for commercial reasons that, they've incentivized not to do that. They need to go and do something else. We're not, if you are listening to the difference between 10 minutes and 15 minutes as a parent, that doesn't seem as significant because your focus is that child, right?
Yeah.
If you're popping away from what you're doing to check on your sleeping baby, your ability to do so and the degree of focus that you have is completely different from, I mean, in the same way as a teacher doesn't have the same amount of time to spend on 30 kids as they do to, impart information to one person. That's the same difference we have. So it's not just the difference between like someone actually having a look at how someone's going and then coming
Mm,
back. It could be, so it's not 10 minutes, right? It's a cursory gaze at 10 minutes and then another cursory gaze up to 10 minutes. So we could be talking about more than that, which is concerning, right? It's already probably not good enough. The ratios that we have of young people who ideally we would like to grow up to be in our society,
mm.
there is something quite kind of anti-human about
Yeah.
the way that
Misanthropic.
yeah, misanthropic is a good word, is about the way that these regulations are being considered. And it's creepy, right? There's something
Yeah.
like Brooke Van Velden-esque about the value of life that we've
Yeah.
put.
What?
You know?
But like, because I guess what I feel about right-wing politics is, especially in like this stage, and I feel like we're seeing this reflected in the United States as well, in Australia, I think, and basically all the Anglophonic countries, is there's the real desire to have like winners. Like we really want to have people who win. And the thing about like winners is you need losers, and the losers need to lose fucking hard. And you need to be able to point at the losers and be like, don't be like those miserable reprobates who like made all these mistakes and stuff. And if you have a functioning society, it can actually be quite difficult to have like the requisite amount of losers. I don't know. And I feel like maybe there's this feeling that like instead of trying to create more winners, it's actually easier just to make more losers, to make an ever smaller group of winners feel better about themselves. I don't
I
know.
mean, it is. I mean, it is, right? Like it is measurably easier to disenfranchise more people from a democratic system and then say, look, this 10% of people who are doing okay are the winners, and you're welcome. Here's your meritocracy.
Yeah.
But look, we can keep talking about this kind of school to prison pipeline, which is how I'm envisioning this kind of conversation. But there have been some criminal law changes, both kind of actioned and honestly, more concerningly, just kind of floated, which may just be kind of running them up the flagpole, and it may be indications of what this government actually plans to do with, as usual, our kind of most disenfranchised, most, should we say, bullied? What's the word?
Targeted?
Targeted. Yeah, that's a good word. Our most targeted kind of communities. So at the same time, which I think is interesting, right, is that there are a couple of different suggestions for how to pile more penalties onto people who are committing things that are already crimes. But I think it's interesting that like these two things don't go together, right? But the one punch attack suggested law change, which like will happen, is just an additional penalty being added on for attacks that are, I guess, proven under whatever definition that is, as being what used to be called a king hit and then a coward punch, and now apparently are called one punch attacks, which is, I think, adorable and very like anime sympathetic. It's nice to move with the times, but it's interesting, I think, that this, as usual, quite from this government, quite sudden law change is happening at the same time as the slapping kind of fines on people doing shoplifting is the way they're advertising it, but essentially like low grade property theft. And it shows that there's a level of kind of, I think, inauthenticity to it, that the reason you would do this is because you want to go up in the polls when it comes to law and order, because it's the only thing you still have as a right-wing government. And that's one of the few things that National and New Zealand First and ACT can all agree on, is they want to put more brown people in prison. But I'm
Some of these
curious.
came from New Zealand first, in fact.
Yes, there you go. So I'm curious to hear what Simone has to say about this.
So am I, Philip. Sometimes I start talking and I don't know what's going to come out. Um, I think it is interesting that we call them coward punches. The rhetoric there implies that there is a kind of brave violence, which I think intersects quite well with the ideology that we have behind sending soldiers to the Ukraine, behind facilitating genocide in Israel, this creation of brave violence as heroes in comparison with the folk devils of, the shifty young, probably young man in a community who hits somebody else, but when they're not expecting it, which is cowardly, and we abjure that sort of thing. We hate that sort of violence, right? Because it's not brave. Whereas I don't know what they're expecting. Is it brave? Does National want people to do pistols at dawn? Is a duel where you face each other the kind of brave violence? We don't know, but the notion of a coward punch tells us, I think, a lot about what kinds of violence are acceptable. Of course, forcing most of the population to go hungry, for people to die of exposure, to starve, for people to have preventable illnesses or lack of treatment from hospitals by your policies, social murder, in other words, that's not cowardly, even as you enrich yourself and everybody else enriches themselves, while they do it. That's not cowardly for some reason. What is cowardly is a person coming up behind another person at a bar and punching them, and that person being felled. Now, this is part of a whole suite of tough on crime, quote unquote, legislation which is being put through. And part of that has been, we've already seen 3 strikes, sentencing changes coming into effect, capping all discounts at 40%, something which I predict will have a deleterious effect on police intelligence, because some of the biggest discounts you can get actually are for informing on other people in organized crime networks, for obvious reasons, because then if you get put into prison even though you've informed, then there's an immediate target on your back. That's a death sentence to you, right? And so to undo some of these drug networks, police oftentimes give or offer up, plea deals or something, an equivalent to that. We don't call them that. We're not really supposed to think about it that way, but they are effectively what you would see as a plea deal in Law and Order, unfortunately. And so the effect rebounds. The other thing is that for young people, they might not ever get a chance to get off the off-ramp out of being on that kind of conveyor belt of criminality and being imprisoned and then not having a life when you get out, and then constantly being back and forth through into prison. And of course, this is quite deliberate because, as you say, Philip, the attacks on people for quote unquote property crime, things like shoplifting from supermarkets, which are coming about, we know, because of supermarket lobbying of both the police and also the parties in government. So this is an exercise of outsized corporate power against ordinary people, and the institution of their kind of private surveillance systems through Aura, which we joke about, but really is a kind of unchecked terror in this country. These all come at a time where beneficiary levels have never been higher, where unemployment is quite high, where the reserve army of young people is just out there and unable to do anything, and they're being punished for being young and finding it harder to get jobs at a time where the idea of getting a job and the process for getting a job has become a professionalized role in itself, doing everything right with your CV, doing things through LinkedIn, creating like this kind of persona. Like, it is a business in itself to try to get a job these days. And we pretend like there is a healthy economy when there simply aren't roles going. And the idea of introducing AI at the same time, this quote unquote AI, something which isn't artificial intelligence, as we've said before, but the purpose and the intent of the rollout and the blitzkrieg of rolling out these quote unquote AI tools is to try to destroy the power of labor. It's to try to push people out of employment, to cut down labor costs. That probably won't happen because these things just don't work. But in the interim, for these next few years, what is going to happen is that we will have far more people who are unemployed, as we already do. And at the same time, those people are receiving benefits that are not enough to live on. And for young people, their future rapidly slips out because they can't, there'll be a gap in their resume, which is too long. And we see people essentially pushed into and forced into this kind of cycle of criminality. This is going to be the effect. It's already been the effect. There's been an uptick. Even when I had started practicing in Hamilton, in particular, in the criminal legal aid space, I saw that there was this considerable uptick in people who were there for what we might call crimes of need, or in some sense that there is, we might just call them poor people crimes, right? Rather than white collar, particular fraud or something that is, so obvious there. And I think it's really important to think about the fact that this comes also at a time where they're intentionally trying to create an increase in the prison population in order to be able to fill up those prisons, because that will be a private moneymaker for businesses which run security, people like Serco, that there will be a profit involved in this human misery. And this is the entire intention of it. And I apologize, I haven't talked about the very particular kinds of offenses that we see. But I do think it is important for us to understand how all these things interlock, maybe before we talk about the particulars.
Yeah. No, I think that's really important. And this is what connects these things, right? Is starting off by talking about education even from our very youngest ages, like how we treat our literal babies in our society, and then growing up, look what happens to you, right? There is like the school to prison pipeline has been, massively overused as kind of a buzzword, but this is literally what we're looking at under this government. And as some kind of context over the last month, the changes that we're seeing economically is cost of living still going up thanks to the laser focus of Chris Luxon and his executive team on the cost of living. Strangely, it's still going up. Imagine how bad it would be if he wasn't laser focused on the cost of living, listeners. Construction jobs going down, business confidence is going down even, which, typically under a national government you'd expect to be at least coasting. Public housing and welfare is being screwed down or cut in real terms. 240,000 people are underemployed, so, they may have a kind of a half the amount of work that they want, or they may have a part-time gig where really they need more to support their whānau. 180,000 people on job seeker support, real terms job compensation is going down. So most people aren't getting pay rises to keep pace with inflation. Tertiary numbers are staying low, which I think is interesting because in recessions in the past, people have made the kind of rational choice to go back to study, right? Because if you're not going to get a job, you may as well get a degree. You may as well do something to upskill yourself. But that's not happening this time, which I think is like an indication that there's a real lack of hope, not just in the economy, but in kind of society as a whole. Because why wouldn't you get a degree? And I mean, not a degree necessarily, but a certificate in something, Learn some skills. There's kind of a lack of curiosity or yeah, that level of kind of upskilling our economy that we would see in a really like a functioning society. R&D spend is staying really low across society as a whole, and that's obviously led by the government. In a small country like New Zealand, it's really the only kind of major, it's the big game in town. If you want investment in R&D, government's where to start that, right? So I do think that's kind of an indication of worse things to come, even though in some ways kind of the economic winds are changing. But basically, when it comes down to it, the only rational thing to do in New Zealand, if you have a couple of $1 million to spend, is still buying a house because we don't have a capital gains tax. So, like, why would you take a risk, right? To what is that, casino? Why take the risk, right?
And what's more productive than a bit of like timber put together that just sits there?
Exactly. Just buy a house off someone who already made it and then
I had
wait.
an argument with the so-called economist about this once on Twitter, and apparently he like appears on television or something, and he was like, "There's nothing more productive than housing." I was like, "What? Like it existing? Like it just sitting there? It's a precondition for productivity because you need to have somewhere to live. But it fucking doesn't do anything, you dipshit. Like this guy's got a PhD and he's being invited on to talk onto things. What do we do? Open the schools, except that apparently the schools teach you fucking nothing. Like." These people are morons.
Open different schools.
Open different schools. This is why, by the way, this is exactly why business school is separate from economics departments, because actually what they teach you in economics is fantasy. And if you want to like run a business, you actually have to learn how to do it, So
Well, I mean, you'd think that, but
although mind you, the kinds of economics that they teach is very much like profit equals revenue minus costs.
I mean, like I shouldn't say we, New Zealand society needs a brutally carceral system to protect our houses that are increasing at above the value of inflation every year, right? Hence the importance of this like carceral conversation, where quote unquote small business owners tell us all that there needs to be an increasing authoritarian crackdown on
Listen, aside from the fact that they are
liberty.
hoarding food, the reason why supermarkets are villains is because they essentially indoctrinate their workers or encourage them to see their identity as tied with the identity of the business. which is exploiting them because every amount of profit that their business takes is produced by their labor, which they don't see, the surplus value that they don't see, right, in their paycheck.
I've seen.
And
I've
so
seen,
they cause. Sorry, what were you going to say?
I was going to say I've seen a manager at Woolworths literally run out of the shop and grab someone, a huge guy, literally like hold him and say, you can't take that from my shop." And I said, "Is this your shop? Like, it's not your shop, mate. Like,
No.
you work here."
You are also being exploited. But the idea is to try to, create that kind of ideology that it's a team effort, everybody's involved in loss prevention, right? And there's no understanding of what effect any of this has, because it is effectively a victimless crime as well. Like you are cutting into profits. That's it.
Yeah. I just wanted to throw it to Ginny to talk about
No one ever
Fast-moving
wants
consumer
thrown.
goods.
your
No
greatest
one ever wants it thrown to me. But I'm not about to defend supermarket conglomerates, by the way, in case you were wondering what was going to happen now.
What? But Ginny,
But
what
they're
is your
people.
job?
Look, just because I know people that work at Aura, doesn't mean that I'm in. Why do people look so shocked when I say this? Like, every time I say I know someone who works at X and X morally dubious company, Simone looks really shocked. And I'm
Ginny
like,
flicks through their Rolodex and it's just like a list of the world's evil people. What is going on here?
How many Palantirs
You've got
do
like
you
the
need?
Batman Rogues gallery. You're like, let me call up Joker.
it's like, no, the only thing that's missing from my Rolodex is like the ability to like put it on a phone and swipe like I'm on a dating app. Like, you know,
Looking like Hannibal, looking through the recipe cards that he took from people who are rude to him, but it's just like people
That's
from
good.
Palantir, that you want to call on a date and maybe eat their organs afterward or during. I don't know what they're into.
I mean, look, all I'm saying is there's a subsect of people in society who work at these fangs who are all seeking immortality. And when they reach immortality, they're going to unlock some freaky sex. All right. Like, that's all I have to say on the topic. But no, I actually don't know why Philip's going to throw it to me. But I actually wanted to talk a little bit more about some other related criminal law changes. I feel like we glossed over a little bit the ones that basically let people do citizens arrests, like Red Dead Redemption style on people. Because I don't want to say following that story, because it makes me sound crazy to be following a story like that. But essentially, I don't know if people know this about the proposed amendments that would allow people to make more citizens arrests. But the government had a working group put together, right? Like, that's the group that came up with this stuff. Like, the government went, okay, who are some trustworthy or experienced people in the retail advisory space who could tell us
God.
what we should do for small business owners. And one of those people that they picked is Sunny Kushal. And like, that name is a blast from the past, honestly. If you're in Auckland, like, it's just, he's still here, I guess. That's awesome. But one thing I want to say about this working group is that I think a working group is probably the least efficient way to solve anything, from like a policy perspective, from a strategy perspective. Like, a working group, especially if you're conducting like a working group with private individuals, it's just a money sink. A working group is what you do when you have a friend that you kind of want to give some money to. And you're like, oh, I think maybe his expertise is like tokenly related to what I want to solve at this company or organization or government. And that's what this ministerial advisory group for the victims of retail crime, again, crazy name, basically is. Because I think the only real victims of retail crime, as Simone has already suggested, are the corporations, right? Like, why do we have a working group looking out for the interests of ostensibly the monopoly, the duopoly that we have in the country for supermarkets? Anyway, this working group, which had Sunny Kushal and a bunch of other people on it, they are the ones basically who have suggested these hardline reforms to the government, to the justice minister, about retail crime. And I don't know if you guys remember when we had a period of the government being really, really crazy about how dangerous ram raids were, how everything was so terrible for a dairy or a small business owner. And a couple of people who were affected by these ram raids were dairy owners themselves. They were saying, okay, what if maybe we had more beat cops on the street to help? I'm not a fan of policing, just putting it out there. But these were some things being floated by people who were small business owners themselves. They were like, maybe more beat cops, maybe like help with security. And And instead, I suppose this retail crime working group that is meant to serve the interests of small business owners plus Woolworths said, no, 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 more policing not necessary. What we will do is let just anyone intervene to stop if shoplifting is happening, which sounds crazy. Because not only because you can intervene at kind of almost anywhere you like at this point, barring some very token restrictions, there is a clarification in these reforms, which basically states that you can use restraints when making an arrest
Hot.
and that you can use reasonable force. And I feel like saying these things out loud almost guarantees that people are going to use restraints and are going to use unreasonable force, especially on younger people who are, I think, the bulk of the people being sort of caught by this imaginary crime wave the government has sort of up in their heads. But like, if you think about the average age and profile of the young people, almost children, who are being talked about during the ram rage, I guess, quote unquote, crisis, like the people who are going to be affected by citizens' arrest are like younger people of non-Pakeha descent, essentially, who are going to have like random old people or anyone on the street just try to bash them because they've shoplifted some bread from the dairy. Like, I think it's just ridiculous. Like, it sounds insane. And I think that the other problem that I have with this working group is not just that I feel like these are laws that are just created by like a villain in a pocket dimension in a superhero movie. Like, if you heard this as like a plot point and you were like, oh, like I'm Dr. Evil and the home planet I come from, like we let like strangers like bash kids if they steal food when they're starving. Like, it's just so like Dickensianly evil. Like, it just can't be real. But the kind of people that come up with this stuff are getting paid almost $1,000 a day to be on this working group.
Yeah.
Which is a publicly reported figure, by the way. Like, you can literally go and check this on the Parliament website. Like, they're paying people like this $1,000 a day, not counting travel reimbursements, accommodation reimbursements, meal
Per diems.
reimbursements. They have a private office space in Auckland, right? Where I guess this working group can hold meetings or something like that. And it's like they've spent so much money on this working group. Why couldn't we have spent this money on more staff for kind order, right? Like, why couldn't we have spent more money on this for any other government department? Why did before the Justice Minister even talked about this publicly to the media? Why did they pay people in this working group close to $100,000 last year before they made any public recommendations? Like, it's just a rort at this point. You're throwing money into the void that is your friend's bank account at this point. Like, this is not something that you do because you, A, care about people, B, care about small business owners, or C, can really ostensibly say that you care about anything other than like your own profits. Like, the government has so clearly just picked Justice Minister picks so clearly just a guy that I think will just never say no to him. Right? He just picked a friend who will yes man him the whole time. And that to me is just like insane. I just hate it. It's terrible. So.
Oh, I mean, I know some people who are, undertaking vast public money theft, and we need to citizens arrest them. They're this working group. Like, it is a ticking clock. How long until, or at least they're much increasing the likelihood that we are going to see a George Floyd in this country, not from police, but from private people who have, not to say when police do it, it is right, but to say people who have like less training and that it's zero, who are not held accountable in the same way, people who will be praised. We're creating this kind of culture which is going to create the sort of conditions which they have in the United States for their private right-wing militias and people who see it as their duty to carry out their kind of ideological grievances against enemies. This is going to be the creation of that. It's one block along the way, right, of building the most cursed Lego set in existence.
I mean, we already have untrained cleaners in hospitals being expected to also be security guards, which is just absolutely deranged. Thank you, Simeon Brown. Like, that is the expectation that we have of people who are expected to physically block or remove people from spaces where they shouldn't be, or, imagine somewhere where you might be more psychologically disturbed than in a hospital. That is peak. That is where you are at your worst, right? If a loved one is in danger or in some way in trouble, or it might be yourself, right? The defunding of security in hospitals, which is already, at a really bare bones minimum, has been subsumed into their cleaning budget, which is like, look, imagine, close your eyes, listener. Think about who you picture mopping the floors in a hospital. Is that someone you want stopping someone in the worst moment of their lives from thrashing out and hurting someone else in a physically trepidatious, dangerous situation? I think that is like an absolute, even as I always say, kind of even at a kind of social democratic perspective, this is really just breaking the bounds of what we see as a functioning society, I think. And that is just cruel and unusual in a way that I think is like just unacceptable. It's fucked. It's fucked. And I don't know how you come back from that.
What if it's John Wick? What if it's John Wick with a mop? Did
But
you ever
like
think
it
about that?
shouldn't be. Like the cure to the government's mismanagement of infrastructure shouldn't be let's make more vigilantes. Right?
Jenny,
Like
what
am
if
I
they know how to
crazy
do that
saying
like
that?
Chinese martial art with the long arm poles? What if they know how
Okay,
to do that with mops?
but Jenny, you don't have the right imagination. I think vigilantes could solve this situation, just not the kind the government's
Save the
thinking
city.
of.
It's
My
Matt
city. Starling City. Felicity.
Matt Damon as a cleaner coming in and finishing the equation for how to keep the hospital safe on the blackboard.
We're turning everybody into superhero, like the accountant, or whatever that Bob Odenkirk one was, the dad or something
Well,
like
the
that.
one with
Like,
Ben Affleck where his superpower is just being on the spectrum.
yeah, but he knows AK-47s, which some of my oomph, like, to be
Isn't
Yeah.
that,
fair,
isn't that kind of every superhero movie these days?
they're all on the spectrum.
Yeah. Superpower.
This is true. I don't know. I was thinking about what you were saying about ram raids, Ginny, because I'm reminded of a person who I was like a young man that I was aware of who was going through the system again when I was practicing in a different region. And in his case, he had no youth history, which is often a precursor to going through the adult courts. So like he had no prior criminal history, nothing else. He fell in with obviously a bad crowd, right? Of people who were sort of encouraging him, and also had nothing to do and very few life prospects anymore as he was coming to the end of his schooling, where again, falling through the educational cracks, right? He fell in with this crowd. They essentially like took a vehicle for a joyride and had like broken into a petrol station after hours, but the fog machine went off, so they didn't take anything. That was like that's aggravated because there's several people right involved with that, and so he was very lucky to one get an EM bracelet, and two that the indication from the judge was, I think if you do good on your EM bail, which doesn't actually give you, by the way, a one-to-one discount
Can you
for
can you
home detention anyway. So you're serving time that you'll never actually end up getting that sort of like full discount for.
can you
Um,
translate EM for the
oh, sorry, electronic monitoring. So bracelet. Um, Sometimes I forget like what's known and what's not known. So he was essentially under lock and key, like home D, right? Like he was serving effectively a sentence, waiting for to go through the process, which takes months and months and months and months, and doing time which would only come back at a 30 to 50%, if you're lucky, kind of discounted rate on your actual sentence. So you are spending time there and wasting time in your life, which serving a sentence which you are not given credit for serving, right? And with these sort of discounts, he would have been pretty much, if it were capped at the amount that it was capped at, he may well have been condemned to imprisonment. And that would have just been the inevitable outcome. And then guess what? When he came out, he wouldn't have I found out that his partner or something, I believe, was pregnant with his kid, even though they were very young. Like obviously there's, this happens sometimes. And they had wanted to keep it, but if he this kid who's just become, like come into the adult court system with no prior history, had not had, those discounts, like he would have just been condemned basically for most of his life. And he actually struggled initially on his electronic monitoring bail because his dad had a long criminal history. And even though he wasn't, like actively doing what he had done when he was a kid, he was pretty upfront and being like, listen, this kid needs to be like, my child needs to be on the straight and narrow, but I don't know what that looks like. And it was quite a struggle, to keep him away from that kind of wider community of people who would get him involved in further criminality than that, right? This kid who formerly had no record, and yet he could very easily have had his life be completely destroyed. And of course, like this is essentially what they want. They want people not to get off that conveyor belt. They want to continue perpetuating harm and for people to have very few options. And inevitably, statistically, a large portion of them will be recidivists. But this is what they want because it creates that kind of profit engine. And these are real human lives. Like if you wanted to come to me and say the sort of language, like what National is saying, like what, what was it? Kaushal said, has reported in RNZ as saying, the offenders were saying they were untouchable, but right now we are creating the consequences, the accountability. If you wanted to say that about like, this, untouchable criminal, this kind of mastermind, and it's just this kid who had no history, who fell in with a bad crowd for a brief time in his life, and say this person ought to be condemned and their life actually is worthless and should be thrown away. And more than that, while that's happening, we're just going to squeeze every little bit of prison labor out of him that we can while he's able-bodied. If you wanted to say that, and also not only him, but his kid, which was going to be born, and his partner, who would have been left without him. If you want to say that those people should suffer as well, and you want to say that this guy's some kind of folk devil, this 18, 19-year-old kid, I don't know what to say to you except that I think you need to be in a re-education camp yourself.
Yeah.
Fix your heart is all I can say to people like that.
Okay.
But we've created a country which empowers all of them and puts them in the driver's seat.
Yeah. No, that's beautiful. Thank you, Simone. Yeah, I do think there's like a really, really like deep-seated fundamental misunderstanding in society and therefore in our establishment media about how we kind of see these folk devils, as you say. Like there's something really like, I don't know, there's something odd, something almost like, yeah, folkloric, like a Germanic kind of demonic figure about these people who just come out of the shadows and do like actions that can't be explained, and then disappear again, like, never to be considered, right? As opposed to considering that maybe, to coin a phrase, we live in a society and these people don't come from nothing, Like there's a reason that people act the way they do, and that might not be pleasant, but if you want to live in the real world, you probably need to understand some degree of history and some degree of kind of material analysis of both where people come from and the reasons that they think the way they do, right? So, I mean, something we haven't touched, but that I think probably all our listeners will be quite familiar with is the idea that when people are in their most distressed states, they're not really considering the difference between 5 years and 3 years in prison, or the direction that someone's head is facing when they're punching them, or whether they're going to steal $499 or $501 worth of groceries from the supermarket. Put yourself in the headspace, right, of someone who's that desperate for 5 seconds and think, like, why are these people acting the way they are? Just because you don't do this thing doesn't mean there's no rational reason to do this thing. And that's just kind of that's what it is to be in a society, right? Like, have you met people before? There's something, I don't know, fundamentally asocial about this individuation that's really kind of insisted upon, I think, in quite an autocratic way by this government. And it's unpleasant and quite a new, I don't know, in quite a new, like, yeah, antisocial, unpleasant way, right? And it's just absolutely disfiguring the social landscape in a way that even during, I I hate to do this, but even during the John Key years, I didn't see that, I think, from the national government. Like, they screwed down poor people's support, but they didn't disfigure the social landscape in the way that I think this so far, fingers crossed, one-term government is doing. And I think that is like a historic kind of wrong that I don't see how we'll come back from without some kind of righteous change from the other direction. Pmax, I was curious what you think of just, I think a lot of this comes back to kind of the expectations of human development
Mm.
because some of this kind of, I think, psychological kind of aspect comes from the way you grow up, right? So that comes down to education and the expectation we have on our youth. So you're our professional full-time education correspondent. Why can't you tell us what is up with the youth these days and why do they?
So basically, to be a teenager, is miserable in this day and age. And largely, you either have to completely, like, a lot of our youth are compartmentalizing because everything is going to shit. Like, so essentially, either you ignore everything that's going on and you're like, I am just going to focus on myself, which, to be fair, is teenagers since the dawn of time. Let's not drag them too much here. Or they'll sort of focus on one particular issue. But a lot of teenagers as well don't have systemic awareness, and this is where like sabotage of the education system is working out very much to the right wing's favor. Because yeah, it's the kind of thing where if you talk with your average teenager about like, oh, not the lovely teens who are like marching with the school strike for climate, basically you'll be like, oh, like what is the issue, like what is the environmental issue of the time? Like what are environmental issues? Like, oh, there's a lot of rubbish around. There's a lot of pollution. But when they say pollution, they mean like, plastic bags in the stream or something like that. It's the direct observable, and then it's how do you fix that? Oh, I eat less meat. I don't drive as much. It's sort of like inability is the wrong word because I think generally most teens do have the ability to comprehend systemic issues. It's just like not something that's heavily prioritized by our education system, and it's not like our education system is prioritizing children actually learning. It's glorified daycare to keep the few people who are still employed in New Zealand employed instead of at home caring for children, which increasingly seems to be something that government is disincentivizing. Yeah, sorry, kind of rambling there. Did that answer the question or
Yes, yeah. Never apologize. Never apologize, double down, exactly. Yeah, I was just wondering like the perspective of an educator on how people grow up in this fucking, in this
yeah.
hellscape. It's
Yeah.
easy to, it's easy to look at the world through whatever the opposite of rose-tinted glasses are, I guess shit-tinted glasses. And just see like a hellscape.
Well, I think
Uh,
yeah, I think the biggest problem is anytime someone young does become aware, it's like, oh, yeah, like, oh, climate change is being driven by these factors, which means that like, we need to reduce our like oil consumption or whatever. And then they like look at the actions that our government is taking, look at the actions that the Trump government is taking, look at the wealth and power of the Gulf states and so forth. And it's just like, oh, fuck, there's like no solution. There's no like, there's nothing that can solve this. And you see like, even what New Zealand left-wing parties will talk about things like, well, we've got a plan to reduce our carbon usage by 2050 or something like that. And it's just like, fuck, man. And then they're like, how am I ever going to buy a house? And it's like, oh, well, we're going to make it so that property developers can build houses out of cardboard. They'll still cost $300,000 and like, the Yimbys all have a huge party celebration, but it's like not very heartening. And I think like this is where like TikToks about communism can shine because thankfully the immortal science does have the answers to these problems, but it's never something that organically within our system teenagers are exposed to because I mean our education system is theoretically politically neutral, but it like there is an element of it that is just like maybe indoctrination is a bit strong, but sort of like oh you got to make sure that they understand the fundamentals of capitalism as like taught by economists. And it's a little frustrating, because then you're also teaching them like, hey, the world's fucked, and the system that we're teaching you is like the only viable way to organize society literally has no method of dealing with any of these problems that many of you are directly facing and engaged with and like fully aware of, because you're like living this poverty. And then like, and understandably, a lot of teachers won't sort of, they'll try to not depress the students, which is understandable because, you know, you don't want to depress teenagers much more than they already are. And we'll just sort of like, I don't know, not give a full accounting or what have you. But it's, to each their own.
All right. The last thing we wanted to briefly chat about was the referral to the International Criminal Court of New Zealand figures, which is it important? Is it not important? What does it mean? Listen to the next 5 minutes to find out. We do have a couple of articles actually on 1of200.nz. Go to our website about the import or not of the International Criminal Court, both as an institution and as a political vehicle, and I think that distinction is quite interesting. But if you're less of an international criminal law nerd than I am, which I'm aware 99.9% of people are, then look, maybe don't read those articles. Just have a look at the titles and go, damn, that's an interesting issue. Look, international criminal law as an institution, I think, has its flaws, as everyone I think would agree. But the underlying kind of value set of that as a way to view the world, I think is interesting to contemplate in the 21st century post a set of war crimes committed both by friends and enemies of the West, and seeing that as kind of a trajectory through time with I'm going to use the word apogee because fuck the world, of Israel at this modern kind of moment, really historically kind of changing the understanding of the value of what a war crime is. I think even in the imperial core, where traditionally there's been really just, incredible support of a state that has been committing war crimes for decades, in a way that has been criticized by the global south again for decades. Rest in peace, Nelson Mandela. All of the kind of the great figures of the global south were and are interminable critics of Israel as a colonizing, occupying force, right? So I do think it's interesting that the ICC, through, I guess, kind of legalistic inertia, I want to say, has been kind of dragged into having some degree of, legalistic, I suppose, consistency when it comes to something that should have always been the case, right? But I'm curious to hear what you think, Simone, because that's kind of where I'm coming from. I don't think the ICC has a huge amount of, I mean, that no, not a lot of legs to stand on, let's say, but that doesn't mean that it's not a valueless institution. But the fact that the PSNA in New Zealand has reported New Zealand figures to it, which I think is great. And it is wild that the New Zealand media hasn't even produced a single story about it, as far as I can see. That is a story, right?
Yeah, absolutely it is. In respect of the ICC itself, this is one of the criticisms that's long been levied at it, is that since its creation, it essentially only prosecuted African warlords or people who weren't actually the big fish to fry, So, for example, George W. Bush almost certainly should have, been tried for crimes. That never happened. So one of the criticisms was, oh, you just go after Africans. Now we are seeing that the ICC is attempting in some sense to say that Israel is going beyond the pale. And of course, unlike the ICJ, it looks at specific persons who are liable for crimes. So someone like Benjamin Netanyahu, a number of other Israeli cabinet figures have arrest warrants out against them. And nevertheless, when Iran, in self-defense, shot back at Israel, little while ago, Netanyahu was able to just fly out to Greece and weather it and not have to be there in Tel Aviv when that was happening. And he, despite having gone to Europe with an arrest warrant out against him, was never arrested because there's no enforcement from these European countries which are complicit. And apparently, not satisfied at having committed a Holocaust, Europe has decided that it wants a second bite at the cherry of Holocaust against Palestinians this time. I think it is really important that the Palestine Solidarity Network, Aotearoa, has done this and has put together, as Mick Hall has reported. I highly recommend looking at Mick Hall's Substack. A 103-page referral document. This has been put together properly to give referral to the ICC so that it urges the ICC to undertake an investigation as to whether or not these figures, including Christopher Luxon, 3 of his cabinet ministers, ought to be out, and some business leaders in New Zealand who might be found guilty of, being complicit in genocide because of what's happening in Israel and against Palestine. And the ICC has to decide whether or not now to then undertake an investigation as to whether or not there should be indictment, etc., and arrest warrant put out. So this is only a very early stage of a process, but it is very important, I think, for everybody. And good on PSNA for having laid out exactly how all of these connections work, like exactly what it is that David Seymour has said, that Christopher Luxon has said, which has helped to enable and facilitate this genocide, as well as business leaders who have profited from this. So, for example, CEO Peter Beck of Rocket Lab, which has its ties with the American military-industrial complex. It's very important that people having included, I think, this kind of fusion between state and capital in carrying out these kind of the greatest crime of the decade, right? So good on them is really what I have to say. It is a developing story. We will see whether or not there is an investigation undertaken, but I think they have presented a cogent argument for violations of international law to the extent of criminality. In particular, I think there's been a focus on the Rome Statute, but there are a number of other instruments which are also involved.
Yeah, I mean, prima facie, that's what you'd expect, right? This is the exact. If international criminal law was a functional tool that could be leveraged towards the purpose of international justice, this is the exact kind of complaint that you'd expect to be raised a hell of a lot more often, right? And this should be what's kind of top line in our international politics news, is that there is a prima facie case against our leaders for complicity, or, depending on how you want to structure it, at the very least, kind of support for war crimes internationally, which is, some might say bad. I'm going to say bad.
Some say war crimes are bad. I don't know.
Yeah, sorry to be.
Yeah, I mean, we joke about this, but realistically, if they're going to give us citizens arrest powers and there's a warrant out against Christopher Luxon, you know what to do, folks.
Yeah, I mean, people tried when Tony Blair came to New Zealand. Christopher Luxon's in New Zealand a lot, so
yeah, not as much as he should be, though.
Kyle is going to censor this, just so you guys know. Like, we're absolutely going to
Kyle, you're an absolute coward for doing that. If there are IDF soldiers who are on holiday here, ta-da!
Coward mode activate. All right, we should wrap.
Wiki. Oh, not that kind of rap.
Wiki.
Yeah.
Pmax, you want to rap for us?
Want a freestyle for us?
No, I don't know if I want to be a part of that.
I emphatically do not want to freestyle.
I'm sure you do it for
we
kids.
We can't let this white boy spit.
Can a white boy spit a few bars?
No, never. Not on this podcast.
That's basically all we have. So thanks, Ginny. All right, let's terminate this disastrous pregnancy of a podcast. I appreciate all of your mahi. Thank you, Pmax. Do you have any final thoughts for us?
My final thoughts are: if you are a teacher and you're listening to this podcast, you are duty bound to bring the immortal science into your classroom in whatever way, shape, or form you can, to give the children of the future hope and the tools to deal with the problems they're faced with.
I mean, I've met teachers who listen to this podcast, so I know you're out there. I appreciate it, and I guess just basically bully Pmax into being your mentor and how to pass on the immortal science in a way that doesn't make you just immediately fired, but maybe puts that on a, I don't know, burner for a few
And
years.
how to go on hinge dates. Yeah.
All right, well, keep that for your own podcast. Simone.
Yeah.
That could be-
Carl, if you cut this, you're a coward. You know, if we're going to make it legal to restrain people, at least take a Shibari class or two, I think.
2, you're a fast learner, Simone.
There's no reason why you can't look. Listen, what do you think Boy Scouts was supposed to prepare you for? It was 2 things. 1 was transitioning, 2 was being gay, and 3 was like tying people up with knots. So I think that when we do the citizen's arrest, I want to see some Spider-Man suspensions, like they're swinging from a web. Okay.
Hooks in the back, baby. Ginny.
Yeah, well, I'm not gonna say anything about government subsidized shibari or anything like that, or going on Hinge. But yeah, I mean, my closer is that I think it's really funny that David Seymour has called the co-leader of Te Pāti Māori basically a dickhead for his posts and sharing for his Instagram posts. Which kind of makes me feel like the ACT Party knows that they don't have the mandate of heaven, and they're just like trolling through people's social media at this rate to try and discredit them any way possible. So full support to Te Pāti Māori. Fuck the ACT Party.
100% up TRP. Also, I mean, what the hell? Establishment media, like, how is that? That should never be. That
I
should never be
know.
an establishment media story. That is
It's
like
ridiculous.
really scraping the bottom of the barrel material when it comes to fucking social media, right?
Mhm.
Like that is like a 21-year-old social media kid, like just before logging off. Oh, this person said a thing I disagree with. Okay, like chill out, mate. Like this doesn't have any connection with policy or your leader is literally like one of the most powerful people in the country. This is it's embarrassing. Like the fact that sorry to pull out full Kyle mode, but that is embarrassing that media figures would treat that as a serious story. It's not. It's not. Log off. Like, I don't know. Talk to someone in real life, touch grass, like find out what's going on in your community. This is incredibly lame and like you're bad and you should feel bad for authoring these stories. Okay, that's been another episode for 1 of 200. Couldn't finish without punching establishment media in the nose. I'm sorry, I'm not going to work for you. Thank you very much, Pmax.
Catch you later.
Thank you very much, Ginny.
No problem.
Thank you very much, Simone.
Bye or nada.
Oh, well, okay. Well, sleep on that. Thank you, everybody. We will be back next week for current events.
With
Bye-bye.
Daddy's home.
If artificers are then I'm living a pointless life, but learning all your lessons. Fucking politics, there's no distinction. The road's upon now. It's paid with good intentions. And I'll admit that I'm at a loss for what to say when they quote this as a cost we ought to stay. 'Cause I live amongst the people every day. In this vindictive, forgetful fucking rain, it feels like we're